Get out, now! I said get out! Out of my room!
She had a closet the size of most people's apartments, a father worth $11 billion, and a mother who never once told her no. But in less than 4 months, Audrey Winslow would lose the only version of herself she had ever known, standing in front of a family who owned nothing, waiting for her to prove she deserved to stay even one more night under their roof. This is the story of a girl who was given everything, and the single decision that finally took it all away. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand exactly who Audrey Winslow was before that decision was made, because without understanding the girl she used to be, you will never understand the woman she was forced to become. Audrey Winslow was 19 years old, the only child of Richard and Elaine Winslow, a couple whose fortune came from a technology empire that touched nearly every corner of American life. She grew up in a penthouse that overlooked an entire city skyline, attended by staff who had worked in that home longer than she had been alive, and educated in institutions where tuition alone could feed a small town for a year. From the outside, Audrey's life looked like a fairy tale. From the inside, something had quietly rotted. Somewhere between her 10th birthday and her 19th, Audrey had stopped seeing the people around her as people at all. Waiters became obstacles, assistants became tools. The woman who had raised her more than her own mother had, a housekeeper named Grace, had become nothing more than furniture that occasionally spoke. It started small, the way these things usually do. A raised voice here, a cancelled order there, a tip withheld out of spite rather than dissatisfaction. But by the time Audrey turned 19, small had become a pattern, and the pattern had become a personality. She would scream at store clerks over the wrong shade of a dress. She would humiliate waiters in front of 40 guests over a few drops of spilled champagne. She would tell her own mother, in front of staff, that people who worked with their hands simply lacked the intelligence to do anything else. And through it all, her parents, two of the most powerful people in the country, watched their daughter transform into someone they no longer recognized, someone they were beginning to fear they had created. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What nobody in that penthouse knew, not even Audrey herself, was that the breaking point was already approaching, quietly, in a way none of them could stop. It would not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It would arrive the way most reckonings do, as an accumulation, one final call from a friend's mother, one final resignation letter, one final night where two exhausted parents finally ran out of patience for a daughter they loved but could no longer recognize. And when that night came, it would not just change Audrey's living arrangements, it would strip away everything she believed made her who she was, and force her to rebuild herself from nothing, in a place she never could have imagined, surrounded by people she had spent her entire life looking down on. Richard Winslow was not a man who made decisions lightly. Every deal, every hire, every dollar that moved through his company passed through careful calculation before it ever became action. So when he finally decided what needed to happen to his only daughter, it was not out of anger. It was out of exhaustion, and something closer to grief. He had watched Audrey humiliate a store clerk to tears over a shipping delay. He had watched her tell a driver he was lucky to even be allowed near her car. And on the same evening that Grace, the housekeeper who had worked in that home for 11 years, finally placed her resignation letter on the kitchen counter without a single word of explanation needed, Richard understood that talking to his daughter had stopped working months ago. That same night, 2 phone calls arrived within 20 minutes of each other, both from mothers of Audrey's closest friends. Both women described, in painful detail, how their daughters had come home in tears after a rooftop party where Audrey had humiliated them in front of dozens of guests, over something as small as a spilled drink and a disagreement about a waiter's tip. Elaine Winslow sat on the living room couch that night, phone in her lap, unable to speak. She thought of every warning sign she had chosen to explain away over the years, every cruel comment she had excused as teenage moodiness, every staff resignation she had quietly blamed on people being too sensitive, rather than on her own daughter's behavior. For the first time in a long time, Elaine allowed herself to admit the truth she had been avoiding. Her daughter was not simply going through a phase. Her daughter had become someone cruel, and continuing to protect her from consequences was no longer love. It was enabling. When Audrey walked into the living room that night, She expected another version of the same conversation she had heard 100 times before. The gentle disappointment, the soft lecture, the eventual surrender where her parents simply gave up and let her walk away unchanged. What she found instead was silence, and two parents who would not meet her eyes the way they normally did. On the table between them sat a single sealed envelope. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not lecture. He simply told her that things were going to change, starting immediately, and that the decision had already been made. Audrey's confidence, the same confidence that had carried her through 19 years of never once hearing the word no, began to crack in real time as she watched her father slide that envelope across the table toward her. She reached for it slowly, her hand trembling in a way she would later admit she had never felt before, not once in her entire life. Whatever was written inside that envelope, she understood in that moment, was not a suggestion. It was a decision that had already been finalized, one that no amount of arguing, no amount of tears, and no amount of her usual manipulation was going to reverse. As her fingers touched the edge of the paper, Richard Winslow said only 5 words to his daughter, 5 words that would end the life she had always known, and begin a story that neither of them could have predicted the ending to. He said quietly, "You leave in 3 days." What Audrey did not yet know, sitting frozen at that table with an unopened envelope in her hands, was that those 3 days would be the last 3 days of her old life. She did not know that her father had already spent weeks arranging every detail of what was coming, weeks of phone calls, weeks of research, weeks of quietly building a plan designed not to punish her, but to save her from the person she was becoming before it was too late to come back from it. She did not know that her passport had already been renewed. She did not know that a family in a small farming town, a woman named Marisol and her son Daniel, had already agreed to take in a stranger for 90 days as a favor to a distant relative who worked for the Winslow family's charitable foundation. And she certainly did not know that everything she believed defined her, her wealth, her status, her ability to simply demand and receive, was about to be stripped away completely, leaving nothing behind except the raw, unfiltered version of who she actually was underneath it all. Over the next 3 days, Audrey tried everything she knew how to try. She begged, she screamed. She threatened to call lawyers she did not actually know the names of. She reminded her parents, over and over, exactly how much money they had, as if the amount in their bank accounts had ever been the thing standing between her and consequences before. But for the first time in her life, none of it worked. Richard Winslow had made peace with a decision that would hurt in the short term, in order to save something far more important in the long term, and Elaine, though heartbroken, stood firmly beside him. On the morning of the 3rd day, Audrey Winslow boarded a private plane with a single suitcase, no phone, no credit cards, and no idea that the 90 days ahead of her were about to become the most difficult, and ultimately the most defining, chapter of her entire life. She believed, as the plane climbed above the city she had always called home, that this was simply a punishment to be endured, a temporary inconvenience she would laugh about with her friends the moment it was finally over. She had no idea that the woman waiting for her at the other end of that flight, a stranger named Marisol who owned nothing close to what the Winslow family considered basic necessities, was about to teach her more about herself in 90 days than 19 years of private tutors, elite schools, and unlimited privilege ever had. She had no idea that the boy she would soon meet, a young man named Daniel who had given up his own future to hold his family together, was about to challenge every assumption she had ever made about who deserved respect and who did not. And she certainly had no idea that somewhere in that small farming town, surrounded by people she had been raised to look down on without a second thought, Audrey Winslow was finally going to be forced to confront the one person she had spent her entire life avoiding, herself. What happened next did not simply change Audrey's circumstances, it changed the entire trajectory of who she would become. And by the time those 90 days were finished, the girl who once refused to acknowledge a housekeeper by name would find herself unable to imagine ever being that person again. The truck came to a stop in front of a house that Audrey Winslow, in any other version of her life, would not have believed people actually lived in. There was no gate, no security booth, no marble underfoot. Just packed dirt, a wooden porch, and a woman standing in the doorway watching her with an expression Audrey could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet judgment. Audrey stepped down from the truck in shoes that had never once touched unpaved ground, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be somewhere money could not reach. The woman in the doorway was named Marisol, and she did not rush forward to greet her the way every person in Audrey's old life had always rushed to greet her. She simply waited, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch until Audrey herself broke it. That first night set the tone for everything that would follow. Audrey was handed a plate of rice and beans, food she would have once refused without a second thought, and told plainly that there would be no substitutions, no special requests, and no second option waiting in a pantry somewhere. She sat at the table in silence, staring at the plate as though it belonged to someone else's life, and when she finally pushed it away and announced she would simply go without dinner, Marisol did not argue. She did not plead. She simply turned back to her stove and said that hunger had a way of teaching lessons no lecture ever could. Audrey went to bed that night on a thin mat on the floor, staring at a ceiling made of tin instead of imported plaster, and for the first time in 19 years, nobody came to check on her, nobody adjusted the temperature of her room, and nobody apologized for the discomfort she was feeling. She was, for the first time in her memory, simply left alone with herself. The days that followed only deepened Audrey's sense that she had been dropped into a version of reality she had never once had to consider. She was taught to carry water from a well nearly a quarter-mile from the house, a task that left her arms shaking and her expensive travel clothes soaked through with sweat within the first week. Daniel, Marisol's son, offered to help her more than once, only to be met with sharp refusals rooted in a pride she had not yet learned to set down. She complained constantly about the heat, about the lack of a proper mattress, about the absence of anything resembling the life she had left behind. Daniel, for his part, rarely reacted the way she expected. He did not raise his voice. He did not seem interested in proving anything to her. He simply continued about his day, teaching at the small village schoolhouse each morning, tending the family's modest crops each afternoon, and treating Audrey's outbursts as though they were simply weather to be waited out, rather than storms requiring a response. It was a small moment, one that Audrey herself would later describe as the true beginning of everything that changed inside her, though at the time it seemed like nothing at all. A young girl from a neighboring house, a child named Lily, sat crying on the steps of the schoolyard over a broken sandal strap that had already been tied back together more times than the fabric could hold. Audrey's first instinct, the same instinct that had carried her through 19 years of dismissing other people's problems as unimportant, was irritation. But something in the girl's face, the quiet acceptance of a hardship she had clearly learned to expect rather than resist, stopped Audrey in a way she did not fully understand. She knelt down beside the child, examined the broken sandal, and found herself thinking, for the first time in longer than she could remember, about someone else's life instead of her own. She thought of the closet she had left behind, filled with shoes she had never worn twice, and she felt something she did not immediately recognize, because she had so rarely allowed herself to feel it. Shame. The conversation that followed that night would become, in Audrey's own later reflection, the moment the version of her that everyone had once known finally began to crack open. Marisol told her, without softening a single word, about Daniel's full scholarship to a university in the city, an opportunity he had quietly given up the same month his father passed away, in order to keep his mother and sister fed and the village school running. Audrey sat in stunned silence, realizing that a young man she had spent 2 weeks dismissing as simple, as beneath the world she came from, had in fact sacrificed a future most people would never have the chance to walk away from, and had done so without ever once mentioning it to earn her sympathy or admiration. Marisol did not offer comfort in that moment. She offered honesty instead, telling Audrey plainly that she had spent her whole life failing to see the people around her as anything more than background, and that the emptiness Audrey had likely been running from long before she ever arrived in this village had very little to do with money at all. By the time the harvest season arrived, nearly 2 months into her 90 days, Audrey Winslow had become someone the people around her barely recognized from the girl who had stumbled out of that dented pickup truck weeks earlier. She woke before sunrise without being told to. She carried her own water without complaint. She had learned, slowly, and without ever announcing it to anyone, the names of every family living within walking distance of Marisol's home, and she had begun greeting each of them the way Daniel always had, with genuine attention, rather than practiced politeness. She worked beside the villagers in the fields, her hands blistered and her back sore in ways her old life had never once demanded of her, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not resent it. She realized somewhere in those long, sunburned afternoons that the version of herself she was becoming in that village felt more real to her than any version she had ever presented at a rooftop party or a boutique counter back home. Even the smallest interactions began to reveal how far Audrey had traveled from the person she used to be. In the village's only general store, an elderly man named Mr. Harlan watched with quiet interest as the same girl who had once demanded an entire boutique be shut down over a shipping delay now stood patiently counting out coins for a bag of flour, apologizing when she came up short, and offering to return the following day, rather than expecting the difference simply to be waved away. Mr. Harlan told her, without any particular ceremony, that he had seen a great many outsiders pass through the village over the years, and that most of them left exactly the way they arrived. He said Audrey was the first one he had watched actually change in front of him. Audrey did not know how to respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because for the first time in her life, someone's opinion of her mattered, not because of what it could get her, but simply because it was true. With only 10 days remaining before she was scheduled to return home, Audrey found herself standing at the edge of that same field with Daniel, watching the sun disappear behind the hills, and admitting something she had not been able to admit even to herself until that moment. She was afraid, not of the 90 days that were ending, but of the version of herself waiting for her back in the penthouse she had once called home. She had spent weeks becoming someone she was proud of, someone who noticed people, who carried her own weight, who no longer measured her worth by what she could demand from others. And she did not know, standing in that field, whether that version of herself could survive contact with the world she had come from, a world built entirely around the belief that people like her were never required to change at all. When Audrey Winslow finally returned to the penthouse that had once defined every waking hour of her life, her father barely recognized the young woman standing in front of him. Gone was the designer luggage, replaced by a single worn bag she had carried through 3 connecting flights, without once complaining. Gone was the practiced boredom she had worn like armor for as long as he could remember. In its place stood someone quieter, steadier, and far more thoughtful than the daughter he had reluctantly sent away 90 days earlier. Richard Winslow, a man who had built an empire out of calculated decisions, found himself uncharacteristically speechless, searching for words to ask the only question that actually mattered to him in that moment. Whether the daughter standing in front of him now was simply passing through a phase, or whether she had genuinely become someone new. What Richard Winslow did not yet know, standing in that penthouse foyer studying the daughter he barely recognized, was that Audrey had already made a decision of her own, one that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with who she now wanted to become. She was not simply going to return to her old life and treat those 90 days as a story to tell at parties. She intended to go back to that village, not as someone completing a sentence, but as someone choosing a life she had never known she needed until she was forced to live it. The girl who once refused to acknowledge a housekeeper by name, who had humiliated waiters and dismissed an entire town of people as beneath her notice, had finally learned the one lesson her father's fortune had never been able to teach her, that the measure of a person was never found in what they owned, but in how they treated the people who owned nothing at all. Audrey told her parents over breakfast the following morning, the same table where her father had once slid a sealed envelope across the glass surface and changed the course of her entire life. This time there was no silence, no unreadable expression on her father's face, no trembling in her own hands. She explained, calmly and without needing their permission, that she intended to split her time between the city and the village, continuing her education, while also helping oversee the well system, the clinic, and the schoolhouse that had already begun to change the trajectory of an entire community. Elaine Winslow listened to her daughter speak with a clarity and purpose she had not heard from her in years, and found herself, for the first time since Audrey was a small child, simply proud rather than worried. 3 months later, the well was complete, funded quietly through the Winslow Family Foundation, and built by hands from both the village and the city working side by side. Audrey stood beside Daniel as the children ran toward it, filling their first buckets in seconds rather than the better part of an hour, and she felt something settle inside her that she had never once felt while standing in any boutique, any rooftop party, or any room filled with people who had once told her she could have anything she wanted. She understood, watching those children laugh over something as simple as clean water arriving faster, that this was the first time in her life something she had done actually mattered to someone other than herself. The clinic followed soon after, smaller than the well, but no less significant to a community that had previously traveled hours for basic medical care. Marisol stood in the doorway on its opening day, watching neighbors she had known her entire life walk through a door that had not existed a year earlier, and she thought of the frightened, overdressed teenager who had once stumbled out of a pickup truck onto her front step, certain she would not survive 90 days without her old life. Marisol had not expected, when she agreed to take in a stranger as a favor to a distant relative, that the stranger would eventually become someone who changed the future of the entire village. But she had learned, over her many years, that the people who arrived broken were sometimes the ones capable of building the most. By the time the next harvest season arrived, Audrey Winslow had become someone permanently split between two worlds, and she no longer saw that as a burden. She spent half her year in the city, pushing her father's foundation toward the kind of giving that reached people rather than headlines, and the other half in the village that had taught her who she actually was, underneath everything she had once believed defined her. Standing in that field at sunset beside Daniel, surrounded by people who had once been strangers and had become, in every sense that mattered, family, Audrey understood that the girl who once refused to acknowledge a housekeeper by name was not simply gone. She had been replaced by someone who finally understood that the people around her had never been background at all. They had been the entire story, waiting patiently for her to finally notice. And so the story of Audrey Winslow did not end with a punishment finally lifted, or a 90-day sentence quietly served and forgotten. It ended, if it could be said to end at all, with a young woman who had once measured her worth in what she owned, learning instead to measure it in what she had finally chosen to give. Somewhere between a dented pickup truck and a completed well, between a broken sandal and a finished clinic, the girl who had refused to acknowledge a housekeeper by name had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who understood, at last, that the people she had once looked past were never invisible at all. She had simply never taken the time to see them. If you were watching this story unfold in real time, you have to ask yourself the question that still lingers over every version of it. What would you have done, sitting at that breakfast table, 19 years into a life built entirely around never hearing the word no? Would you have opened that envelope the same way Audrey did? Or would you have spent those 90 days waiting for someone to come save you from a life you never chose to understand? Tell us in the comments what you think really changed inside her, whether it was the well, the child with the broken sandal, or something quieter that none of us ever got to see on camera. And if this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happens when a different kind of inheritance gets tested, one measured not in wells or harvests, but in a decision that nearly destroyed an entire family behind closed doors. That story is coming next, and it goes places even darker than where this one started. Before you go, if you want more real stories about the people privilege nearly ruined, and the moments that pulled them back from the edge of who they almost became, make sure you're subscribed, because you will not want to miss what's coming next.